Thank you. Morning, everyone. I'm Matt Clark. I'm the Commercial Director for Nielsen. What I'm going to cover today is really just a very quick overview of the FMCG sector, what the state of the nation is effectively, what we saw in 2017, a little bit of a headline on what we saw at Christmas, and then a few thoughts for the future and how that market might move. Obviously, we're doing questions afterwards, so feel free to save those up for the Q&A. So what are we seeing in Ireland in general, first of all? So a few headlines from the CSO, most of which are generally pretty positive. So consumer price index, 0.5%, slightly creeping up that inflation rate, but still pretty low by historic standards. Interest rates remain low. Unemployment is coming down still. Employment is going up still, so all positive on that sense. Retail sales volume, I'm going to talk about grocery retail in a minute, but overall retail sales volume is up 4%, so again, positive for the overall retail sector. And Ireland's economy continues to be the fastest growing in Europe, so all good news, really like we've seen for the last 3 or 4 years consecutively, as we've gradually made our way out of the recession, and hopefully headlines overnight on the global stock markets will calm down and we won't go back to that. Just the 2 points on the bottom, which in some ways are linked, I think certainly for this industry, the Irish population is one of the fastest growing in Europe. So 1% population growth versus last year, 3.5% population growth since 2011. Obviously, if there are more people in the country, there are more people shopping, and more people eating, more people shopping grocery. So certainly from a grocery FMCG perspective, that population growth is helping to drive overall sales growth, as we'll see. Not so good for housing or transport, but I'm not an expert in those things. So focus on the population number, which has been a real positive for the industry. We do a consumer confidence index, and here we are for the last few years. Pre-recession, this index was up around 100, so think of 100 as being a stable, strong position. During the recession, as you can see here, it dropped right down to the 60s and took a long time to recover, and we saw a fairly slow lag between this recovery in consumer confidence translating into retail sales in general, and then eventually translating into some growth in the FMCG sector. So people bought other things first and continued to try and save money on their grocery bill, which they're still doing today. But we're at this stable position now. They're 99, 100, latest number 103. They're all within a statistical variance of each other, but a pretty stable position. All the figures on the previous chart obviously helping to keep that number up. Some concerns pushing the other way at the moment around what's going to happen with Brexit and the border and those kind of things which are top of mind for people. But in general, we've got a pretty stable position, and consumers are more confident than they've been for a while. And these are some of the things they say as part of that survey. So over half of people say that their personal finances are in a good place. Nearly half say now's a good time for me to buy the things that I want. People are feeling that they've got a bit of spare cash and they're able to buy the things that they want to. We saw at Christmas 2/3 of people saying that they did worry about money at Christmas, but 1/3 of people saying that they didn't worry about money at Christmas. So there are some people who are in a good spot with those financial aspects. But the grocery shop and the grocery trolley is still an area that people continually look to try and save money. And what we always say is it's the single thing that you hand over your credit card for or you hand over cash for is your single biggest bill, because all your other stuff comes out of your bank and you don't actually hand over the money. But you're really conscious of how many euros your big trolley shop costs, and therefore people are still looking for ways to save money on that so they can spend money on other things that they want. So people do change their habits and look for ways to save. And we can see here at the bottom, 20% of people nearly are saying that they don't have any spare cash once they've covered all their living expenses. So it's still very real for a lot of people. So here's what we've seen in the market for total 2017 versus the previous year. The real positive number on here is in total FMCG, we've got 2.2% volume growth. So very much a volume-led growth picture for the market. We had volume growth last year. 2 or 3 years before that, we were either flat or in decline. So it's a pretty buoyant market. 2% volume growth for grocery makes for a pretty buoyant market, obviously backed up by those population numbers. Average price per unit that we see in our numbers is down very slightly at 0.3%. So we've got, that gives us value growth of 1.8%. So still a pretty positive number. This is total grocery, including everything you would see in the store. If we exclude tobacco, which we do in these numbers, just because the tobacco products are the one area in the store where we've got artificial price inflation because of duty rises, so that kind of pushes the prices up. We see that everything else in the store, grocery, household, health and beauty, actually average prices are down 0.9% on the rest of that store. So we have got price deflation in the market, driven by, in part, a shift of sales into the discounters where products are obviously cheaper, and also by price cutting in the likes of Tesco, Dunnes and SuperValu, driving down prices. We've still got volume growth, and therefore the value growth is not as high, but we still, even if you take out tobacco, which is a bit artificial price-wise, then we've still got a positive picture for the market. If we just look at the same numbers for Christmas, so November and December period was obviously a key period for many retailers and manufacturers. Not quite as high as that. We've still got this price deflation, but not as deep. In other words, the prices did go up a little bit more at Christmas versus what we've seen for the rest of the year. But Christmas growth, 1.6% if we exclude tobacco, 1.9% if we include it. So again, a positive picture. And I would have stood here 2 years ago showing minus numbers across the board on here. So for the industry as a whole, I think pretty positive. And this is how we break down the total FMCG market in Ireland into these retail sectors. So the blue bit is the multiples, so predominantly Tesco, SuperValu and Dunnes are in there. And we've got that at 0.7%, so pretty flat overall year on year for the total MAT. The purple bit is discounters, Aldi and Lidl, 6% growth. And this picture is pretty similar to what we've seen for the last 2 or 3 years, and a continued shift really of sales out of the multiples into Aldi and Lidl. And the orange bit is the convenience sector, so symbol groups, forecourts, independent grocers, etc., which we've got at 1.1% growth. I'm going to go through each sector in a minute in a bit more detail. But that's a pretty typical picture of the differences in sales growth that we've seen from each of those 3 sectors over the last couple of years, with discounters now up to nearly 19% share of the market. If we look at the same wheel for Christmas, we see actually for the first time in a long time a bit of a different picture. So we've got the multiple sector growing faster than discounters, which we haven't seen certainly in my time in the last 4 or 5 years. We haven't seen multiples growing faster than discounters. So in that Christmas period, the multiples were the real winners in the market. So what they're doing in terms of range and price and so on really seemed to work at Christmas. So what's going to be really interesting over the next 3-6 months is to see whether this trend continues for the year or this trend continues for the year. But certainly at Christmas, things worked for the multiples, and they started to win a bit of share back from the discounters. Multiples would always have a bigger share of the market at Christmas, just because of the way people shop for their big Christmas items. So the size of the blue section is not a surprise, but the growth number there is one that we haven't seen for a while. But within all of that, consumers are still looking for ways to save on their grocery products. So the obvious ways that they do it: buy things on promotion, switch to discounted products, cut back on luxuries if they need to, and switch to cheaper brands. All of which leads us over to how do they do that? We're seeing a shift in the market at an MAT level at least into the discounters still. So people swapping out of their traditional stores into a cheaper discounter store. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a shift away from brand into private label. So branded sales have been largely flat. Private label sales at a total level in Ireland have been much more buoyant. We've seen more stuff sold on promotion, and we do, to an extent, see a bit of a shift to online, which is still small, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But one of the reasons that people say in favour of shopping online is it allows them to see their total spend racking up in the corner, and they can control their spend that way, which is a bit easier to do than if you're filling it in a trolley. Okay, so what are we seeing in the multiples? So if we just take that blue bit, year on year, as you can see here, average price is down 1%. So we have seen price deflation in the multiples as they try and compete with the cheaper discounter retailers. And as well as competing on price, they're competing on product quality. So for a long time, it was generally received that the private label products in a discounter were better quality than private label in a Tesco or Dunnes, and they're doing a lot more to improve the quality of those private label ranges. And also stress the fact that they do have a range and really make the most of the fact that the larger stores have got larger shelf space and they can stock a range of products, and they're really trying to sell themselves on that, on those benefits. But price is down. We've got volume growth 1.8%. And value 0.7. So still a positive picture, and as we saw at Christmas, really kind of bucking the trend in recent years that they are growing faster than the discounters in that period. If we look at the discounters in isolation, very similar picture on price. So they're competing on price as well, continuing to get a little bit cheaper, 1% price, average price decline year on year, but backed up by a 7% volume growth. And most of that growth is coming from store openings, as we'll see in a minute, and has done over a number of years. So while there's space for the discount stores to open more stores, they'll continue to gain share. When they stop opening new stores, they'll plateau, we think, in the market in Ireland. And over time, there's been a shift slightly away from brands into private label. So obviously they never stopped many brands to start with, and we've seen over the last couple of years that they've pulled back a little bit on branded distribution in favour of more of the private label products. So we're seeing a bit of a shift into private label, and they continue to spend heavily on media. So if you take the media spend of all the retailers in Ireland, then Aldi and Lidl account for 53% of it. So they're really punching above their weight in terms of media spend and really getting that message out, and continuing to do so. And this is the store numbers. So just to illustrate the point I was making before, we've got Aldi, going back to 2011, Aldi had 79 stores, Lidl had 122. And you can see every year since then, they've each opened a number of stores each, which leads us up to 129 now and 153. And this is what's happened to their market share over that period. So extremely close correlation between the number of stores and that market share, which is great for them if they keep opening stores and not so great if they don't. So the stores being smaller get to maturity very quickly, and the like-for-like sales growth is not high, or is not really there in their mature stores, and growth has come from new store openings. Now, last year Lidl said they were going to open 50 new stores in the next 5 years. And Aldi said they were going to open 30 new stores in the next 2 years, I think it was. And if they do that, we'll end up with these kind of numbers by 2020. And if we end up with these kind of numbers, we'll end up with a discounter share, which is 19% today, going up to somewhere around 21%. If they don't open those stores, then it probably won't move much from now. But we think there is scope for them to open those stores, and there are sites and parts of the country where there's still white space for them to open into. And if they get to there, then we reckon that's probably about as far as they'll get in Ireland, but still another couple of points of growth to come from them. A slide on e-commerce, which if you look very closely, you can see the e-commerce bit here. So we reckon around about 0.6% of the Irish grocery market is e-commerce. So bear in mind that it's only really Tesco and SuperValu, and not all of SuperValu. It remains a pretty small proportion of the market in Ireland. That number would be about 6% in the UK. So very different market, very different demographics, and particularly the size of the cities in the UK, which help drive that e-commerce number, but still pretty small in context of Ireland overall. We reckon it's probably in double-digit growth, but even so, probably this will be there for about 1% in the next year or two, but still pretty small, assuming nobody else gets into that market and the current model doesn't really change. And And really the limitations on e-commerce in the current model in Ireland are on the supply. So, if you don't live near a Tesco that delivers, or you don't live near a SuperValu that delivers, then it's not an option for you today. So unless a different player comes in or that model changes, then we wouldn't expect that to grow particularly quickly. But it is something we're looking at, and in the next couple of months we're going to be able to have SuperValu e-commerce data available through our feed, so we'll be able to look at that in a bit more detail. In Ireland, only 13% of shoppers say that they shop online more than a couple of times a month, so very small penetration. And the retailers have been pushing click and collect in order to try and bring in a bit more flexibility to the model. But of these 13%, only a quarter of them use click and collect. So, people are predominantly favouring the home delivery aspects of online. But at this point in time, still pretty small in context of the overall market. And just a word on convenience. This 1.1% growth for convenience is lower than we've seen for the last 2 or 3 years. So as we came out of recession, people had a bit more discretionary spend, a bit more spare income, and in particular the convenience retailers did a huge amount of work in refitting the stores and revamping those stores and changing the proposition. We've seen 2-3% growth for that convenience sector over the last couple of years, and that's slowed down now to that 1% number that you can see there. Price here going the other way. So a lot of that driven by the tobacco pricing. So tobacco accounts for about 40% of the sales in that convenience sector. So whatever happens to the price of tobacco has a big impact on here, but certainly going the opposite way to what we're seeing in the multiples and the discounters in terms of that average price, and volumes declining. So that value is being supported by price rises rather than a volume-based growth. So interesting as we go through this year to see what happens in that convenience sector, because it does look like we're seeing a bit of a slowdown in there, and as the multiples are now focusing on things that seem to be working, then that potentially will have an impact on the convenience sector. Okay, so just to wrap up what we're seeing, imagine this is a store. What we're seeing in Ireland and further afield is a real tough marketplace for brands in general. In particular, those brands that would typically be sold out of the middle part of the store, right? So we're seeing a pull for people that previously bought those brands. They're the obvious ones that you might get from a discounter instead. Good quality, good prices. If times are tough, they're more obvious ones you might shift to private label. Or bulky things you might more obviously shift to online. More around the edges of the store is where we're seeing growth. So categories like confectionery and alcohol are the ones where we're typically seeing value growth. The ambient grocery, household type categories that we see in the middle of the store are ones that at the moment in Ireland are in decline for these reasons. People are still buying that stuff, but they're buying it more cheaply, either from different retailers or shifting to private label. And that picture of a challenge for brands is one we see right across all the markets that we deal with at Neilsen. So, it's not just an Ireland problem. These structural changes in the marketplace with the discount retailers, with potential different online suppliers are making it a tough place for brands. And just to illustrate that, so I talked before about brand versus private label. So in the last year for Total Ireland, the Total Ireland market, brands in 1% growth, so there's still growth there, but private label 4% growth, and obviously that includes all the stuff you would get from Aldi and Lidl. It's not a pure branded product. So private label having the better of it, and within the branded sector, if we look at we do a top 100 brands report that you probably see in Checkout magazine. If we take all of those top 100, between them they're in 1% growth. Those top brands, so it's okay. If we break those into those which are what I've called international brands, so either multinational companies or products you would find elsewhere outside of Ireland as well, sales pretty flat. Local brands, products you would only pretty much find in Ireland, in 3% growth. Obviously the bubbles are the size of the prize there, so there's not as many of those and it's not as big. But what we see is the growth in those local brands. And 3/4 of Irish consumers say that they make an effort to buy local. So there is a bit of a two-lane thing going on here with local brands, there's a pull to buy the local brands that people recognise. A bit less so on the multinational brand side, although clearly we are seeing some winners and losers within that. If we just look at what couldn't fit the whole 100 on here, but I'll put the top 6 up, and that illustrates it quite nicely. That half of these are what you might call international brands. Coke would typically be the number 1 by quite a distance, as you can see, and 3 of the 6 are local Irish brands. And some are winning and some are losing, but we would typically see that picture where the growth that we've seen from local brands, particularly up and coming brands, we've seen good growth in the marketplace. Still possible to get growth though, so Coke, even though Coke are number 1, they're in 2% growth, so they're still growing off the top of that, and they had a very good Christmas as well. So with the right activation, the right implementation in store and so on, then the growth opportunities are there if the brand is strong enough. So where do we think we'll get to? So this is the numbers we saw earlier, where we are today. A couple of years ago, this is what the share picture looked like. So discounters 2 years ago were 17% of the market. Now they're 19%. If they open those new stores that they said they're going to, and they've started on that way, then we reckon by 2020 the picture could look something like this. So 21% share for discounters. Convenience probably holding its own at that 36% level. And therefore that share growth for discounters will come from the multiples, and we think probably the multiple share at that point will be around about that 43% mark. But obviously very difficult to predict the future. But if the thing to listen out for is, are Aldi and Lidl opening new stores? And if they do, I think we'll get to this picture. If they don't, it'll probably stay somewhere around about where we are here. But certainly in the marketplace, with the economic factors that we've seen and the population growth that we're seeing, we'd expect to see value volume growth around about that 1-2% that we've seen now. We'd expect to see that continue, which is obviously a good position to be in for everyone in the room and the industry as a whole. Thank you. Can I sit down?